The cliffs of western Thebes catch first light, and the temple of Hatshepsut seems to rise from stone as if the desert has learned architecture. Along one wall, ships move across a carved sea. Sailors carry sacks, trees, tusks, skins, and strange animals toward Egypt. Foreign houses stand above the ground on posts. Men and women from a distant coast appear beneath palms and resin trees. The scene is precise enough to tempt certainty and strange enough to resist it. It names a land called Punt, a place the Egyptians knew, visited, praised, and desired, yet one that has left no securely identified city, no local inscription declaring its name, and no point on a modern map that scholars can mark without argument. Punt survives as fragrance, cargo, ritual memory, and a shoreline carved in stone. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. To understand why this vanished land mattered, it helps to begin not with gold, ivory, or exotic animals, but with smoke. In Egyptian temples, fragrance was not a decorative luxury added after the serious work of religion had been done. Fragrance was part of the serious work. Aromatic resins burned before divine images, entered temple rituals, accompanied funerary preparation, appeared in medicines and cosmetics, and helped create the boundary between ordinary and sacred space. The Egyptians associated pleasant scent with purity, divine presence, renewal, and life itself. A temple without incense was not merely less impressive, it was incomplete. Its rituals depended upon materials that the Nile Valley could not always supply in sufficient quantity or quality. Somewhere beyond Egypt's familiar horizons grew the trees and shrubs that produced precious resins conventionally identified as myrrh and incense. Though the meaning of Egyptian terms such as anti may have shifted across time and context, these substances came from far away, carried the aura of the divine, and became political power the moment they entered a royal storeroom. This is why Punt appears in Egyptian thought as more than a trading destination. It becomes a land of marvels, abundance, and sacred origin. The route toward it leads south and east, beyond the Nile corridor, across dry wadis and the Red Sea, toward regions Egyptian texts treated as remote but not imaginary. Punt was distant enough to enhance the prestige of any ruler who reached it, yet familiar enough to support repeated expeditions over many centuries. The Egyptians did not speak of Punt only once, as if repeating a legend inherited from an unknown past. They returned to it in royal inscriptions, expedition records, temple scenes, and lists of valuable products. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a durable relationship between the Nile Valley and communities somewhere around the southern Red Sea and the Horn of Africa. The difficulty lies in deciding what kind of place the name described. Modern habits encourage the search for a capital, a border, and a single archaeological site. Punt may not have possessed any of those in the form expected of a modern state. It may have referred to a broad region, a chain of coastal and inland communities, a commercial corridor, or a changing network through which African and Arabian products reached Egyptian ships. Its likely core lay toward the African side of the southern Red Sea, especially around Eritrea, eastern Sudan, and connected interior zones, while trade may also have drawn in Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and southern Arabia. None of this justifies colouring one neat territory on a map and labelling it the Kingdom of Punt. The ancient name may have been flexible, and the network behind it may have shifted as ports, rulers, caravan routes, and sources of resin changed. no single explanation fully accounts for every reference. The objects linked with Punt deepen the uncertainty because they came from different ecological zones. Ebony, ivory, skins, and animals could arrive from African interiors far beyond the coast. Aromatic resins grew in dry landscapes across parts of northeast Africa and Arabia. Obsidian moved through networks connecting both shores. Baboons, prized in Egypt for religious associations, carried within their teeth and tissues a biological record of distant environments. But even these clues point to regions rather than a single harbour. Punt may have been less like one destination and more like the visible edge of a larger system. Egyptian ships could have reached a coastal market where goods from far inland had already been gathered. The people who met them may have represented local rulers, trading families, caravan organisers, or communities whose names have not survived. Yet in Egyptian monuments, complexity becomes order. Foreign landscapes are arranged so that royal authority appears capable of reaching them. Rare trees are lifted from distant soil and made to live under Egyptian protection. Incense rises before a moon, and the king stands as the link between gods, foreign lands, and Egypt's prosperity. This does not mean the expeditions were invented. Archaeology has uncovered the Egyptian harbour of Saw at Mersa and Wadi Gawasis, with ship timbers, ropes, anchors, cargo containers, food remains, temporary installations, and inscriptions connected with voyages to Punt. But temple art cannot be read as if it were a neutral photographic report. Every carved ship and foreign figure belongs to a program of theology, ceremony, and royal memory. That tension gives Punt its unusual power. It is historically real enough to leave ships, records, imported creatures, resins, and recurring royal claims, yet elusive enough to escape final identification. Its products entered Egypt and became visible in temples, tombs, storerooms, and sacred ceremonies, while the land itself remained beyond the horizon. The Egyptians could smell it without fixing it on a map. They could display its wealth without preserving the voices of the communities that produced it. They could turn it into a stage for divine kingship, while leaving modern archaeology to reconstruct the human network hidden behind the spectacle. So the search begins with absence, but not emptiness. Punt is missing in the manner of a place concealed by too many surviving traces rather than too few. A carved coastline suggests one environment, a sacred baboon points toward another. Resin trees evoke dry hills. Ebony and ivory open routes into Africa's interior. Obsidian recalls exchanges across both shores of the Red Sea. Egyptian inscriptions name expeditions but rarely provide the geographical precision modern researchers want. The land recedes each time it seems close, not because it was mythical, but because ancient trade did not obey modern expectations. Somewhere behind the incense smoke was a real coast, real ships, real negotiations, and real people who watched Egyptian sails appear upon the water. It remains scattered among temple walls, desert caves, animal remains, and the faint chemical signatures of distant rain. The search for Punt does not begin with Hatshepsut, even though her temple gives the mystery its most vivid face. By the time her ships are carved into the walls at Deir el-Bahri, Egyptian rulers have already been looking southward for many centuries. Punt enters the record gradually, not as a newly discovered land, but as a destination already embedded in royal ambition, temple economy, and the language of distant abundance. Its earliest appearances are scattered and compressed. A name, a cargo, a boast, A royal annal, these fragments do not describe a complete route. Yet together they reveal that Egypt's connection with Punt was neither accidental nor brief. Evidence from the Old Kingdom places Punt within Egypt's horizon by at least the 3rd millennium BCE. Royal records associated with the 5th dynasty describe expeditions returning with extraordinary quantities of aromatic substances and other prestige goods. The reign of Sahur is especially important because surviving annalistic and temple evidence presents foreign commerce as part of kingship itself. The ruler receives rare materials from beyond Egypt, and the movement of those goods becomes proof that order extends farther than the Nile Valley. Scholars still debate how literally every number and image should be read, but the political message is clear. A successful king does not merely defend Egypt, he draws the wealth of remote regions toward the gods and the palace. At this early stage, Punt is already linked with fragrance. Aromatic resin appears not simply as cargo, but as a substance of transformation. Once unloaded, it enters temple magazines, workshops, medical preparations, funerary practices, and ceremonies in which smoke carries offerings toward the divine. The journey therefore begins long before a ship reaches the sea and ends long after the cargo arrives at court. Administrators must calculate supplies, labour and transport. Desert routes must be crossed, vessels must be built or reassembled. Foreign partners must gather products from regions that may lie far inland. Priests and scribes then translate the expedition into ritual success. What looks in a royal inscription like a simple statement of receipt conceals an immense chain of human effort. The surviving record is uneven because Egyptian monuments preserve royal priorities, not the daily history of trade. They name kings, high officials, gods, and impressive quantities. They rarely identify ordinary sailors, interpreters, guides, port workers, caravan handlers, resin collectors, or the families who maintain coastal settlements. Nor do they preserve the Puntite name for their own homeland. Even the Egyptian term may have covered different zones at different times. The evidence remains incomplete, and silence should not be mistaken for inactivity. Long gaps between surviving references may reflect lost monuments, shifting routes, or changes in how expeditions were recorded rather than the disappearance of contact itself. By the late Old Kingdom, officials serving the crown described journeys deep into the south and encounters with African trade networks. Although not every southern expedition can be confidently assigned to Punt, this distinction matters. Egyptian texts mention several foreign lands, and later traditions sometimes encourage modern readers to collapse them into one exotic southern realm: Yam, Nubia, Wetanet, Punt, and Punt belong to overlapping but not necessarily identical geographies. Goods could move through one region before reaching another. A caravan arriving from the interior might deliver ivory or ebony to a coastal market, while aromatic resin came from drier uplands and baboons from yet another ecological zone. The place named in the final Egyptian record may have been a gateway rather than the original source of every product. During the political fragmentation that followed the Old Kingdom, long-distance royal expeditions became harder to sustain, but the desire for Red Sea access did not vanish. When centralized power strengthened again in the Middle Kingdom, the route toward Punt returned with renewed institutional force. Officials crossed the eastern desert from the Nile to the coast, using wadis that link the river valley with harbours on the Red Sea. One well-known inscription from the reign of Mentuhotep III records the official Haninu leading a large expedition through Wadi Hammamat toward the sea. The text celebrates logistical mastery troops, workers, wells, provisions, and the ability to move through an arid landscape where a failed supply calculation could destroy an entire mission. The destination is associated with Punt, though the inscription offers no map and no neat itinerary. These expeditions show that the sea voyage was only one part of the undertaking. Timber for ships could be prepared in the Nile Valley, transported in pieces across the desert, assembled on the coast, and dismantled or stored after use. Water, grain, tools, rope, sailcloth, and replacement materials had to accompany crews far from permanent settlements. The state mobilized specialists rather than sending a handful of adventurous merchants. Scribes counted, soldiers guarded, bakers produced food, craftsmen repaired equipment, priests established ritual protection. Officials recorded their success in stone, often near the routes or harbours where later travellers might see and remember them. By the 12th dynasty, the connection becomes especially tangible at Sor, the harbour now identified with Mersa and Wadi Gawasis. Inscriptions there refer to voyages toward Punt, and the recently re-evaluated stela known as WG-29 records an expedition under Senwosret II. Its language draws on familiar traditions of autobiography and royal service, reminding us that expedition texts were crafted documents rather than casual notes. Yet the harbour itself supplies what formal inscriptions omit: storage galleries, anchors, timbers, ropes, cargo containers, food remains, and traces of temporary occupation reveal a repeated operational system. Crews return to a place where earlier missions had left equipment, monuments, and memories. The small shrines and stelae at the harbour suggest continuity between expeditions. Travellers did not stand on an empty coast each time. They entered a landscape already marked by predecessors. They could read names, honour officials, perform rites, and place their own mission within a lineage of successful departures and returns. This is a lesser-known dimension of the Punt story. The route possessed its own institutional memory. The harbour was not merely a launching platform but a ceremonial archive at the edge of the desert. Across these centuries, Punt changes in emphasis but never loses its aura. It is a source of sacred resins, a test of royal organisation, and a distant partner whose goods confirm Egypt's connection to the wider world. Each surviving reference is partial, shaped by the needs of a king or official, but the pattern is unmistakable. Long before Hatshepsut claims to reopen the way, generations of Egyptians have already crossed deserts, assembled ships, followed the Red Sea southward, and returned with materials that made the gods fragrant. Her expedition will become the most famous not because it creates the relationship, but because it transforms an old connection into one of the grandest visual narratives ever carved. The route to Punt begins far from the sea, among the stone ridges and dry channels east of the Nile. From the cultivated valley, the Red Sea is hidden behind a harsh interior where distances are deceptive. Shade is scarce, and water determines every decision. Egyptian expeditions must cross this desert before any sail can be raised. The journey therefore divides into two different worlds. First, the overland march through wadis, then the voyage along a coast that remains largely unknown. Each stage demands its own specialists, equipment, and discipline, and failure in either one can end the mission before Punt appears. The eastern desert is not empty, although royal inscriptions often make it seem so. Mining routes, quarry tracks, wells, temporary stations, and long-used paths connect the Nile with the coast. Officials rely on guides who understand where water can be found and how quickly people and pack animals can move between sources. Grain, dried food, jars, timber, rope, tools, sailcloth, and administrative records travel with the expedition. Soldiers may accompany the crews, but the undertaking is not primarily a military campaign. It is a moving workshop, warehouse, kitchen, shrine, and bureaucracy compressed into a column crossing one of Egypt's most unforgiving landscapes. The ships themselves add another layer of complexity. Egypt possesses abundant skill in river transport, but the Red Sea demands vessels capable of different conditions. Timber is precious in the Nile Valley, and large seagoing hulls require carefully selected wood, skilled joinery, and strong cordage. At least some expeditions appear to have prepared ship components inland, transported them across the desert, and assembled them at the harbour. Archaeological finds at Mersa and Wadi Gawasis give this reconstruction physical weight. Timbers, steering equipment, coils of rope, and other nautical remains show that the harbour was not simply a beach where finished ships happened to arrive. It was a place of construction, repair, storage, and repeated preparation. This modular approach solves one problem while creating many others. A ship broken into manageable sections can cross the desert, but every piece must be labelled, protected, and fitted correctly upon arrival. Heavy timbers must be hauled over rough ground, rope must not rot or fray, tools must survive the journey. Once the hull is assembled, seams need to be tightened and tested, masts, yards, sails, and steering oars must be installed. Water and provisions then have to be loaded without making the vessel unstable. The work occurs in heat, wind, and salt, far from the workshops of the Nile. What survives in the record suggests that Egyptian crews solved these problems through repeated experience rather than improvising anew for each expedition. The harbour of Sa becomes the hinge between desert and sea. At Mersa, Wadi Gawasis, crews could shelter in temporary installations, store equipment in galleries, prepare food, and perform rites before departure. Excavations have revealed bread-making facilities and other traces of daily labour, a reminder that long-distance exploration depends as much on bakers and water carriers as on captains. Sailors waiting for favourable conditions may have repaired cordage, inspected cargo containers, sharpened tools, and listened to officials recite instructions. Nearby stelae and shrines link the expedition to royal authority and divine protection. Before the coastline opened southward, the voyage was already being transformed into a sacred and political act. The Red Sea itself offers no simple road. Winds vary by season and location. Reefs, shoals, islands, sudden squalls, and narrow coastal passages make navigation hazardous. The ancient crews lacked modern charts, but they did not sail blindly. They could observe stars, wind patterns, currents, coastal profiles, birds, watercolour, and the accumulated knowledge of earlier voyages. They likely stayed within practical reach of shore when possible, using recognisable landforms and stopping points. Yet coastal sailing was not automatically safe. Reefs are often most dangerous near land, and a favourable anchorage can become exposed when the wind changes. Scholars still debate the exact routes and seasonal timing of particular expeditions, because the surviving texts rarely provide the detail needed to reconstruct a single itinerary. The direction of the prevailing winds presents a crucial challenge. Travelling south could be slow or favourable depending on season and local conditions, while the return north required a different combination of wind, rowing, and timing. Egyptian ships shown in relief carry both sails and crews of rowers, suggesting flexibility rather than reliance on one method. Oars could maneuver vessels in confined water or during calm periods. but rowing a heavily laden seagoing ship over great distances demanded enormous effort. Sailors therefore had to read the environment carefully, waiting when necessary and moving when conditions allowed. A successful expedition was not a straight line across open water. It was a sequence of calculated advances. Fresh water remained the most unforgiving limit. Cargo space devoted to water reduced space for food, trade goods, and equipment. Coastal wells or known stopping places could extend the voyage, but their reliability was never guaranteed. Heat increased consumption, while spoiled provisions or damaged jars could become dangerous quickly. Every delay consumed supplies. An expedition carrying prestige goods home from Punt faced an additional burden because resin, wood, ivory, animals, and other cargo changed how the ships handled. The return voyage may have been even more difficult than the outward journey, especially if living plants or animals required care. Navigation also depended on relationships. Egyptian crews may have used local pilots, interpreters, or trading partners familiar with the southern coast. Such people rarely appear by name in royal texts, but practical necessity makes their involvement plausible. The farther the ships moved from Egypt, the more valuable regional knowledge became. Punt was not reached by conquering an empty sea. It was approached through a maritime world already inhabited by fishing communities, traders, herders, and caravan networks. The evidence remains incomplete, but the Egyptian expeditions almost certainly entered existing systems rather than creating them. This is one reason the idea of heroic discovery can mislead. Egypt did not suddenly reveal an unknown land to history. Its rulers organized contact with people who already knew the coasts, resin zones, animal ranges, and inland routes. The achievement lay in mobilizing a state apparatus across desert and sea, maintaining supply lines, and returning with cargo valuable enough to justify the expense. Each voyage depended on memory preserved in harbors, inscriptions, tools, and human practice. By the time a ship finally turned south from shore, the greatest part of the journey's organization had already occurred. Beyond the harbor, the coastline stretched into uncertainty. The crew knew what they sought, but not every danger between departure and arrival. Somewhere ahead lay the markets, rulers, and landscapes Egypt called Punt. Behind them, the desert route remained their only path home. Between those 2 points, every rope, jar, current, and decision mattered. When Hatshepsut turns her attention toward Punt, she is not opening a route no Egyptian has ever known. She's reaching back into a tradition that carries the weight of royal memory. Earlier kings had sent expeditions toward the southern Red Sea. Middle Kingdom officials had crossed the eastern desert, assembled ships at Sor, and left inscriptions describing voyages to Bir Punt. Yet by the early 18th dynasty, after generations of political disruption and foreign rule in parts of Egypt, the old routes could be presented as neglected, interrupted, or in need of restoration. Hatshepsut's genius lies in taking that restoration and making it inseparable from her own legitimacy. Her reign demands unusual political skill. She rules first within the expected framework of regency for the young Thutmose III, then adopts the full titles and imagery of kingship. This transformation does not erase the fact that she is a woman, but it forces Egyptian institutions to represent her through a language designed for male pharaohs. Statues, reliefs, inscriptions, and ritual scenes negotiate that tension in different ways. Sometimes she appears in female form, sometimes with the body, clothing, and ceremonial beard of a male king. The purpose is not theatrical disguise in the modern sense. It is to place her within the timeless office of kingship, an office believed to maintain cosmic order regardless of the personal identity of its holder. A successful expedition to Punt becomes exceptionally useful within this program. It demonstrates command over labor, ships, desert roads, foreign relations, and temple wealth. It also links Hatshepsut directly with Amun, the god whose priesthood and sanctuary at Thebes stand at the center of her rule. In the official presentation, the voyage is not undertaken merely because Egypt wants valuable cargo. Amun desires the products of Punt, and the king fulfills that divine wish. This framing transforms commerce into obedience, logistics into piety, and imported resin into proof that the gods approve the rain. The expedition probably took place around the 9th year of Hatshepsut's kingship. Although the exact chronology and every operational detail remain debated, its memory is preserved most famously in the temple she builds at Deir el-Bahri, set against the cliffs on the western bank of the Nile. The temple is both mortuary monument and ceremonial theatre, aligned with the cult of Amun and designed to place Hatshepsut within sacred history. Along its terraces, the Punt scenes occupy a carefully chosen space. Visitors do not encounter an ordinary travel account. They enter a visual argument about the king, the god, and the restoration of abundance. That distinction is essential. The expedition can be historically real, while the surviving account remains selective, ceremonial, and deliberately arranged to serve the crown. The official texts imply that access to Punt had been neglected, and that Hatshepsut reopened a route known in earlier times. This should not be read as a literal statement that all contact had ceased completely. Royal inscriptions often sharpen contrast between disorder before a reign and renewal under the reigning monarch. By presenting Punt as distant, difficult, and divinely revealed, the monument magnifies the achievement. Hatshepsut does not simply send ships along an established network. She recovers an ancient connection and returns sacred wealth to Egypt after an age of absence. The message is theological, but it may rest on a real revival or expansion of state-sponsored Red Sea activity. Such an expedition would have required months of preparation and coordination across several landscapes. Officials had to gather crews, provisions, trade goods, and ship components. The desert road to the harbour had to be supplied. Water sources needed inspection. Craftsmen prepared timber and cordage. Scribes recorded personnel and cargo. At the coast, ships were assembled and loaded before the southward voyage began. None of this appears in full on the temple wall because the monument is concerned with meaning rather than administrative process. Yet the archaeological evidence from earlier expeditions at Wadi Gawasis shows what such undertakings demanded. Hatshepsut's fleet stands at the visible end of an enormous organizational chain. The cargo carried outward is less famous than the riches brought back, but Egyptian ships could not expect foreign communities to surrender valuable products simply because a pharaoh claimed divine favor. Exchange required objects considered desirable by Puntite partners. The reliefs indicate goods presented in diplomacy and trade, although the precise balance between gift, tribute, barter, and royal ceremony is difficult to reconstruct. Egyptian texts tend to describe foreign wealth as something delivered toward the king, even when practical relationships were negotiated between parties with their own interests. Punt was not an empty storehouse awaiting Egyptian arrival. Its leaders controlled access to local goods and to the inland networks behind them. This diplomatic dimension matters because the expedition is often imagined as either a peaceful trading mission or an act of imperial domination. The surviving scenes lean toward ordered exchange. Puntist leaders approach the Egyptians. Goods are displayed, and relations appear ceremonially harmonious. There is no clear battle narrative. Yet the absence of violence in a temple scene does not reveal every power imbalance. Egyptus arrives with large vessels, organized personnel, and the authority of a wealthy state. Puntite communities possess the resources, roots, and local knowledge Egypt needs. Each side holds something the other values. What survives in the record suggests negotiation under unequal but mutual dependence, rather than a simple story of conquest or discovery. The products expected from Punt explain the scale of the enterprise. Aromatic resins were required in temples, and Hatshepsut's building and ritual programs demanded abundance. Ebony, ivory, animal skins, gold, living trees, and exotic creatures added prestige and practical value. Yet the most important cargo may have been symbolic. Every sack of resin allowed the temple to burn the fragrance associated with divine lands. Every living tree transplanted toward Egypt made distant fertility visible under royal control. Every foreign delegation carved on the wall demonstrated that the world's edges recognized the pharaoh's order. Hatshepsut's expedition therefore operates on several levels at once. It is a genuine maritime venture, a commercial mission, a diplomatic encounter, a religious obligation, and a statement of political legitimacy. Reducing it to any one of these loses the reason it was monumentalized so magnificently. The voyage mattered because it joined them together. A ship sailing south could become evidence that Amun had chosen the ruler. Resin gathered from dry hills could become temple smoke. A foreign market could become a scene of cosmic order. By the time the fleet returns, the expedition has already moved beyond ordinary history. Its goods will be counted, offered, stored, planted, and displayed, while its memory is shaped into stone. Hatshepsut's artists do not merely record where the ships went. They construct the version of the voyage that eternity is meant to remember. The version of the voyage that survives at Deir el-Bahri begins where ordinary memory usually fails, in images arranged to outlast the people who witnessed the event. Along the temple walls, the ships sail forever. The cargo is always being carried, and the foreign land remains suspended in the moment of encounter. The reliefs are among the most celebrated visual records from ancient Egypt. Yet their apparent clarity can be deceptive. They seem to offer a direct view of Punt, but every tree, figure, animal, and inscription belongs to a carefully designed sacred composition. The artists are not simply showing what happened, they're deciding what the expedition means. The scenes unfold across the Punt portico in a sequence that once formed a more complete visual narrative than survives today. Damage, ancient alteration, later destruction, and the movement of blocks have interrupted the order, leaving scholars to reconstruct how viewers originally followed the story. Ships appear under sail and oar. Egyptian officials stand before Puntite leaders. Cargo is weighed, carried, and presented. Living resin trees are shown with their roots enclosed for transport. Foreign houses rise above the ground on posts or supports, reached by ladders. Palms, animals, fish, and other environmental details suggest a humid or seasonally watered coastal setting connected to drier uplands and inland resources. The richness of the imagery invites close observation, but it does not remove uncertainty. One of the relief's great strengths is the way they preserve details that formal inscriptions might ignore. Hulls, rigging, steering oars, sailors, containers, and loading practices reveal something of Egyptian maritime technology. The houses of Punt, however stylized, imply architectural responses to local conditions. The people are distinguished through clothing, hairstyles, body forms, and position within the scene. Products are not merely named. They are visualized as heavy, awkward, living, fragrant, or rare. A written list can say that trees were brought to Egypt. The relief makes viewers feel the labor of carrying them. Yet artistic specificity is not the same as photographic neutrality. Egyptian temple art follows conventions of hierarchy, order, and symbolic legibility. Important figures appear larger. Bodies are shown from idealized angles. Landscapes are compressed so that several moments and locations can occupy one field. Objects may be enlarged because their meaning matters more than their realistic scale. Foreign peoples are presented through recognizable visual types that could draw on observation, inherited artistic formulas, or both. Scholars still debate how much of the Punt imagery was based on sketches made during the voyage, reports given to artists, older models, and established conventions for depicting southern lands. The inscriptions reinforce the sacred structure. The expedition is ordered by Amun, carried out through the king, and completed when Punt's products reach the temple. In this framework, the voyage is not a self-contained adventure. Its true destination is not the foreign harbour, but the sanctuary at Thebes. The ships may cross the Red Sea, yet the narrative reaches fulfillment only when incense, trees, gold, ivory, ebony, skins, and animals are placed within the religious economy of Egypt. The portico therefore turns geography into ritual. Punt becomes the distant source from which divine abundance flows toward Amun through Hatshepsut's authority. Recent study has added another caution. Comparisons between Hatshepsut's Punt inscriptions and later scenes of foreign products, including those in the tomb of Rekhmir, reveal textual and iconographic parallels. Certain phrases and visual arrangements may have been reused within the elite artistic culture of Thebes. This does not mean that Hatshepsut's expedition was invented, or that the entire portico is copied fiction. It shows instead that Egyptian artists and scribes shaped real events through a shared vocabulary. The same formulas could help audiences recognize foreign tribute, royal success, and sacred abundance. Historical memory was made persuasive by placing it inside familiar forms. That insight changes how the walls should be read. A repeated phrase is not automatically evidence of fraud, just as a conventional pose is not proof that the depicted person never existed. Ancient monuments communicated through established patterns. The reliefs could preserve unusual observations while arranging them according to theological expectations. The challenge is to separate those layers without pretending they can be cleanly divided. A species of bird, the form of a tree, or the structure of a house may carry geographic value. The placement of figures and the direction of the procession may carry ritual meaning. Often both operate at once. Even the famous Puntite couple must be approached carefully. The local ruler, commonly identified from the inscriptions as Parehu, appears with his wife, Ati, and members of their household. Their presence suggests diplomacy between recognizable authorities rather than contact with an anonymous population. Yet the Egyptians control how that meeting is represented. The Puntites approach, respond, and participate within a composition centered on Egyptian success. Their own account is absent. No Puntite inscription explains what they called the Egyptians, what they expected from the exchange, or how they understood the arrival of the fleet. The wall preserves their likeness while withholding their voice. The environment is equally eloquent and selective. Fish beneath the ships, palms near dwellings, resin trees, cattle, monkeys, and birds create a landscape of abundance. A secretary bird identified among surviving fragments strengthens the African ecological signal, especially toward regions adjoining the Horn and northeastern Africa. Still, a temple artist could combine observations from different places to represent a broader southern world. Cargo gathered from inland routes might be shown beside the coast where Egyptians received it. The relief may therefore depict Punt as Egypt encountered it commercially, not as a modern geographical survey would define it. The portico's deepest purpose is repetition. In Egyptian sacred thought, an image carved within a temple does not merely remember an act, it helps sustain it. The expedition's success is renewed as long as the scene endures. Ships continue to arrive. Foreign abundance continues to be transferred. Incense continues to reach Amun. Hatshepsut continues to fulfill the divine command. The wall turns one voyage into a permanent ritual event, protected from the instability of human memory. This is why the reliefs remain both priceless and dangerous. They are the closest thing to a window onto Punt, but the glass is coloured by kingship, theology, and artistic tradition. To treat them as fantasy would discard genuine historical evidence. To treat them as an untouched visual report would misunderstand the temple that preserves them. Their value lies in the tension. They show a real expedition transformed into sacred history, a distant coast reshaped for an Egyptian audience, and a foreign relationship made eternal in stone. Behind the ordered procession, the actual encounter still flickers under the hard light of a southern shore. Unfamiliar voices, negotiations, smells, animals, wet roots, heavy cargo, and sailors preparing once again for the long passage north. The coastline represented in Hatshepsut's temple is not a blank exotic backdrop. It is one of the few attempts in Egyptian art to make a distant environment visibly different from the Nile Valley. Houses stand above the ground on supports. Ladders rise toward their entrances. Palms, resin-bearing trees, cattle, fish, monkeys, and birds occupy the same visual world. The scene is compressed, idealized, and shaped for temple meaning, yet it preserves an important truth. Punt was understood as a lived landscape, not merely a warehouse of luxury goods. Egyptian sailors entered a place where communities had adapted to local water, heat, terrain, animals, and trade routes long before the ships arrived. The raised houses are among the most memorable details. Their floors appear elevated, with access by ladders, and this has encouraged many attempts to identify the exact coastal setting. Such architecture could respond to damp ground, seasonal flooding, insects, ventilation, security, or the use of space below the dwelling. It may also be partly stylized by Egyptian artists seeking a clear sign of foreign life. No surviving structure can be matched with certainty to the buildings on the wall. Scholars still debate whether the houses reflect direct observation, reports from travellers, older artistic patterns, or a combination of all three. Water is present throughout the composition. Fish swim beneath the ships, indicating a maritime approach. Palms and other plants imply access to moisture, while resin-producing trees evoke drier slopes or inland zones. This mixture may represent a coastal settlement supplied by varied ecological regions, rather than one habitat containing every species and product. Goods could have descended from uplands, moved through valleys or caravan tracks, and accumulated at a port or market. The punt seen by Egyptians may therefore have been the commercial meeting point of several landscapes. That possibility helps explain the diversity of products. Ebony and ivory point toward inland African networks. Cattle and animal skins reflect pastoral and hunting economies. Monkeys and baboons require knowledge of capture, transport, and care. Aromatic resins came from trees adapted to arid environments, often far from sheltered anchorages. Gold might arrive through another chain of exchange. The Egyptians could receive all these materials at one coastal destination without that destination being the original source of each one. Punt's wealth may have rested less on owning every resource than on connecting people who controlled different ones. The living resin trees dominate the landscape because they are more than cargo. Their roots are shown enclosed in baskets or packed containers, ready to be carried aboard ship. Resin could be gathered, dried, and transported in sacks. But a living tree offered something more ambitious, the possibility of transferring the productive landscape itself. Hatshepsut's expedition did not merely seek fragrance for immediate use. It claimed the ability to bring the source of fragrance into Egypt. Whether all the trees survived is uncertain, but the image makes their removal a central act of royal power. Transporting them would have been difficult. Roots needed protection from drying and physical damage. Containers had to hold soil or packing material while keeping the tree stable. Salt spray, heat, wind, limited fresh water, and movement at sea threatened survival. Once aboard, every plant occupied space and added weight. Sailors had to balance the needs of the trees against those of the crew and other cargo. The lesser-known achievement is not simply that trees were loaded, but that planners believed the task possible after a long voyage through the Red Sea and across the desert routes toward the Nile. The reliefs also show cattle, complicating older images of Punt as nothing more than an incense shore. Cattle imply herding, water management, grazing, exchange, and social value. They point toward communities whose economy combined local production with long-distance trade. The animals may have been wealth, symbols of status, or part of diplomatic exchange. Their presence places Punt within broader Northeast African pastoral worlds. It also reminds us that the people on the wall were not simply collectors waiting for Egyptian demand. They had their own systems of livelihood and value. Birds add another geographic clue. The identification of a secretary bird among fragments from the Punt scenes is important because the species belongs to sub-Saharan African environments and strengthens the argument for a location on the African side of the Red Sea. This does not fix Punt at one point, but it narrows the ecological imagination. The bird suggests contact with open grassland or savanna connected to the coast through movement and trade. Like ivory and ebony, it may represent inland reach as much as immediate shoreline habitat. Monkeys and baboons appear as signs of southern abundance, but their importance reaches beyond spectacle. In Egypt, baboons carried religious associations, especially with Thoth, lunar order, writing, and the rising sun. Their behavior at dawn may have contributed to interpretations of them as creatures greeting the sun. Imported animals crossed from ecology into theology. A baboon brought from the south did not remain merely foreign. It could enter temples, sacred animal systems, artistic symbolism, and eventually mummification. Its body became part of Egyptian religion while retaining chemical and genetic traces of its original environment. The people of Punt appear as rulers, family members, attendants, and participants in exchange. Their clothing and ornaments distinguish them from the Egyptians, yet they are not shown as defeated enemies. They stand within their own setting, accompanied by goods and animals. This does not make the image neutral, but it preserves a diplomatic tone. the Egyptians needed cooperation, access, and knowledge. Punt leaders controlled the networks that made valuable cargo available. The meeting is staged under Egyptian authority, but behind it lies a practical reality of negotiation. No single modern coastline reproduces every detail in the relief. Eritrea, Eastern Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and southern Arabia all contain environments or trade connections relevant to parts of the evidence. The strongest current interpretation places Punt's core in the southern Red Sea and Horn of Africa, particularly on the African side, while allowing a wider network to cross the sea and reach inland. This is more cautious than searching for one lost capital. The landscape may be composite because Punt itself may have been a composite world. For the Egyptian sailors, however, the first impression was immediate rather than theoretical. After weeks of preparation and dangerous navigation, the coast offered shade, fresh supplies, unfamiliar architecture, resinous smells, animals calling from nearby settlements, and people ready to bargain. The temple freezes that encounter into order, but the real shore must have been restless and alive. Goods arrived from beyond sight. Languages crossed through interpreters. Trees were inspected. Animals were fed. Cargo was weighed against what Egypt had brought. Punt was not hidden then. It was present in the movements of a working landscape whose roots stretched far beyond the harbour. The objects gathered at Punt mattered because they crossed more than distance. They crossed categories. A sack of resin could begin as sap from a tree in an arid upland, pass through local hands and coastal markets, endure the voyage north, enter a temple storeroom, and end as smoke before a god. Ebony could become furniture, ritual equipment, or a sign of royal wealth. Ivory could be carved, inlaid, counted, and displayed. Animal skins, gold, living creatures, and rare woods carried practical value, but also the prestige of remoteness. Their journey transformed them, and in Egypt that transformation gave foreign materials a power greater than their weight. Among all these goods, aromatic resins occupied a special position. Egyptian texts and images often distinguish incense-like substances, but modern identifications remain uncertain. The term antiocem, frequently translated as myrrh, may not always refer to one botanical species or even to one chemically consistent product. Different resins could have been blended, substituted, or described according to use rather than plant taxonomy. Scholars still debate the precise meanings of several ancient terms, so it is safer to speak of aromatic resins, including substances conventionally identified as myrrh and incense. What is certain is that these materials were valued enough to justify state-organized journeys across desert and sea. Their importance came from function as much as rarity. In temples, incense purified spaces and accompanied offerings. Fragrance marked the transition from ordinary surroundings into a divine environment. Priests washed, clothed, fed, and perfumed cult images whose presence sustained the religious life of the state. Smoke rose in front of statues, altars, processional shrines, and sacred boats. In funerary practice, aromatic materials entered embalming compounds, anointing, wrapping, and ceremonies intended to preserve the body and restore identity. In medicine as cosmetics, resins could serve as ingredients in salves, fumigations, cleansers, and perfumes. This same imported substance could therefore move between theology, health, burial, and personal care. This wide demand explains why fragrance became political. A king who secured resin secured the continued operation of major cults. Temple rituals required regular supply, not one dramatic delivery followed by decades of silence. Large building programs and festivals increased consumption. Hatshepsut's close association with the moon made the acquisition of Punt's products especially meaningful. By filling storerooms and presenting resin to the god, she demonstrated that her rule restored abundance. The cargo announced that distant landscapes yielded to the divine order she maintained. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri emphasize quantity. Sacks and heaps of material appear in organized procession, while officials record and present what has arrived. The counting itself matters. Egyptian administration converted fragrant substances into measurable assets. Scribes could register weight, origin, destination, and allocation. Priests could receive portions for ritual use. Workshops could distribute ingredients to specialists. Royal monuments then converted bureaucratic success into sacred spectacle. What began as a product collected from trees became an entry in an account, an offering in a sanctuary, and an image of universal kingship. Ebony followed a different path but carried similar prestige. Dense, dark, and difficult to obtain, it was useful for fine furniture, boxes, ritual objects, handles, inlays, and luxury manufacture. Egypt had native woods, but high-quality timber was limited, and imported species expanded what craftsmen could produce. Ebony arriving through Punt may not have grown beside the port where Egyptians received it. It could have travelled from farther inland through exchange networks extending across northeast Africa. Its presence, therefore, reveals the depth of Punt's commercial reach. A coastal encounter could connect Egypt with forests beyond the horizon. Ivory worked in the same way. Tusks were visually dramatic, heavy and associated with both wealth and distant animals. Once brought to Egypt, ivory could be carved into combs, handles, furniture elements, gaming pieces, containers, and ceremonial objects. Its value came from rarity, workability, and the labour embedded in its transport. Every tusk implied a chain of capture, exchange, carrying, storage, loading, and protection. The temple wall displays the final result while concealing most of the people who made that result possible. Gold complicates the picture because Egypt already possessed access to major gold-producing regions in Nubia and the Eastern Desert. Gold listed among Punt's products may have come through overlapping networks rather than from a single Puntite source. This is another warning against imagining Punt as one self-contained kingdom producing every item shown. Trade centres accumulate goods from elsewhere. A ruler receiving gold at a port may be receiving the output of miners and intermediaries living far away. What survives in the record suggests that Punt's importance lay partly in aggregation. Animal skins, monkeys, baboons, and perhaps other creatures added another form of value. Skins entered ritual and elite display, while living animals embodied the strangeness of southern lands. Baboons were especially significant because they could become sacred animals in Egypt, associated with Thoth and with solar imagery. Their capture and transport required specialized knowledge. A living animal could not be packed like resin or stacked like timber. It needed food, water, confinement, and handling through heat, storms, and long delays. Its arrival therefore advertised both the reach of the expedition and the control required to bring animate cargo home. The Puntite side of the exchange remains harder to see. Egyptian monuments celebrate what Egypt received but say less about what local communities wanted in return. Beads, tools, metal objects, cloth, grain, manufactured goods, or prestige items may have circulated outward. Diplomatic gifts could overlap with barter. Egyptian records might describe foreign products as tribute, even where negotiated exchange occurred. No surviving Puntite account explains the transaction from the opposite shore. The evidence remains incomplete, and the language of royal possession should not be mistaken for a complete economic description. Still, the scale of the cargo suggests organized cooperation. Resin had to be collected without destroying future yields. Trees and shrubs were known by season, location, and quality. Inland goods had to reach coastal markets. Animals had to be captured and maintained. Containers, weights, interpreters, guards, and carriers were needed. Punt's wealth was not simply natural abundance waiting to be removed. It was knowledge applied to landscapes and routes. The Egyptians encountered a functioning system, then represented that system as the generosity of a foreign land toward their king. Once the ships returned, the goods disappeared into Egyptian institutions, but their origins were not entirely erased. Their foreignness increased their power. Resin smelled of distance. Ebony carried the darkness of unknown forests. Ivory recalled animals beyond the Nile world. Baboons retained the behavior of another environment. Each object brought Punt into Egypt without bringing Punt itself. This may be why the land became so difficult to locate later. Its products were preserved, consumed, carved, burned, buried, and worshipped, while the commercial geography that delivered them slowly changed. The material survived as sacred value even when the root behind it faded. Behind every cargo unloaded in Egypt stood people whose names have almost entirely disappeared. The temple walls preserve rulers, officials, and arranged foreign figures, but the network that made the voyage possible was much larger. Resin collectors worked in dry uplands. Herders moved animals between pastures. Carriers brought ivory, ebony, skins, and gold toward coastal markets. Interpreters moved between languages. Local leaders negotiated access, protection, and exchange. Egyptian scribes counted what entered the ships, while sailors secured living plants and animals for the return. Punt survives as a place of products because the people who produced and moved those products were rarely allowed to become the center of the record. The best-known Puntites are the ruler Parehu and his wife Asi, shown in Hatshepsut's reliefs with their household. Their appearance has attracted attention for generations because the artists present unusual physical specificity. Yet the temptation to treat their bodies as a direct ethnographic key must be resisted. Egyptian art could combine observation with convention, exaggeration, hierarchy, and symbolic contrast. 80's distinctive form has inspired medical speculation, but no diagnosis can be securely made from a stylized temple image. What the relief establishes more confidently is status. The couple is positioned as recognizable local authority, capable of receiving the Egyptians and participating in formal exchange. This matters because it challenges the idea of Punt as an unorganized wilderness visited by a more advanced state. The Egyptian expedition arrives within a political and commercial order that already exists. Someone must authorize access to the harbor or settlement. Someone must gather goods, maintain routes, assign labor, and decide what will be exchanged. The presence of a ruler and household suggests that the Egyptians dealt with leaders whose influence extended beyond a single dwelling. Whether Parehu governed a town, a district, a trading community, or a wider coalition remains unknown. The evidence remains incomplete, but he was not simply a merchant encountered by chance. The scene also preserves a diplomatic tone. The Puntite leaders approach the Egyptian delegation without signs of military defeat. There are no bound prisoners, shattered fortresses, or piles of weapons. Instead, people present goods, observe one another, and participate in a staged encounter. Egyptian inscriptions may describe the products as marvels, tribute, or offerings drawn toward the pharaoh. But such language belongs to royal ideology. Practical exchange likely involved negotiation. The Egyptians brought items considered valuable locally, and the Puntites controlled access to resources that Egypt desired. Neither side entered the meeting without leverage. What Egypt offered is less clearly recorded than what it received. Tools, beads, cloth, food, containers, and prestige objects may have moved outward, but the surviving evidence does not permit a complete list for Hatshepsut's voyage. Some items may have functioned as diplomatic gifts rather than direct payment. Others may have been exchanged through valuations understood by both parties. Ancient trade did not always separate commerce, tribute, and ceremony as neatly as modern categories do. A gift could create obligation, a royal offering could conceal bargaining, a formal presentation could conclude weeks of practical negotiation. Language must have been a central challenge. Egyptian officials could not assume that local leaders spoke Egyptian, and the Puntites may have dealt with traders from several regions. Interpreters were therefore essential, though invisible in the reliefs. They had to translate more than words. They explained measures, qualities, promises, routes, and expectations. A misunderstanding over weight or timing could delay the fleet. A poorly translated gesture could damage trust. The success of repeated voyages suggests that some people developed lasting knowledge of both commercial worlds. The coastal communities associated with Punt probably occupied a strategic position between sea and interior. They could receive Egyptian ships while drawing products from inland environments. This role may have created wealth and authority, but it also required cooperation across distance. Resin gatherers, pastoralists, hunters, miners, caravan leaders, and port households did not necessarily belong to one political unit. Their connections may have been seasonal, flexible, and based on kinship or exchange rather than centralized administration. Punt may therefore have been a name Egyptians applied to the outer face of a network whose internal complexity they only partly understood. Women likely played important roles within that network, although Egyptian sources reveal little. Ati's prominence beside Parihu shows that elite women could be represented in diplomatic context, but the scene cannot tell us whether her status was political, familial, ceremonial, or all three. Women may also have participated in processing resins, managing households, producing textiles, preparing food, caring for animals, or organizing exchange. Such labor rarely appears in royal accounts, yet long-distance trade depends on it. The missing detail reflects monumental priorities, not women's absence from economic life. The Egyptian side was equally diverse. The fleet included officials, scribes, sailors, rowers, craftsmen, guards, cooks, handlers, and probably religious personnel. Rank shaped how the voyage was remembered. Senior men could receive titles and inscriptions. Most workers disappeared into collective images, yet success depended on their competence. Sailors kept ships stable while cargo was loaded. Handlers managed animals. Gardeners or knowledgeable attendants may have supervised the resin trees. Scribes recorded quantities without slowing the exchange. Craftsmen repaired damage far from Egyptian workshops. Daily life during the encounter was probably less orderly than the relief suggests. Cargo accumulated unevenly. Animals resisted confinement. Water and food had to be replenished. Local people entered and left the settlement. Egyptian crews inspected hulls and rigging. Negotiations paused, resumed, and perhaps moved through several levels of authority. The smell of resin mixed with smoke, livestock, salt water, wood, and human labour. The temple wall converts this activity into a calm procession because order is the point of the monument. Reality must have been noisier. The most striking absence is the Puntite voice. No local archive has been found in which the people of Punt describe Egypt, name their ports, or explain the exchange. Everything passes through Egyptian categories. The foreign ruler is identified because Egypt chooses to identify him. The products are listed because Egypt values them. The landscape is preserved because it serves the story of Hatshepsut and Amun. This imbalance is unavoidable, but it should remain visible. Punt was not merely a distant object in Egyptian history. It was a human world with its own memories, ambitions, rivalries, and sacred meanings. When the ships departed, the Puntites watched part of their landscape leave with them, trees uprooted, animals confined, stores of resin packed away, and rare materials carried toward another civilization's temples. In return, foreign goods and new obligations remained behind. The encounter changed both shores, though only one side carved its version into stone. Behind the enduring image of abundance was a relationship maintained by people who understood roots, seasons, trust, and value. Their names are mostly lost, but without them there would have been no Punt expedition at all. The living trees are among the most audacious objects in Hatshepsut's Punt reliefs, because they turn a trading expedition into something closer to environmental conquest. Resin could be packed into sacks and measured by weight. A tree carried its own future. It contained roots, moisture, soil, seasons, and the possibility that the sacred fragrance of Punt might no longer depend entirely on voyages beyond Egypt. The image of men hauling these trees toward the ships therefore communicates more than abundance. It suggests that Hatshepsut intended to transfer part of Punt's productive landscape into the realm of Amun. The trees are often identified as myrrh-bearing plants, though certainty is difficult. Egyptian terms for aromatic substances do not always correspond neatly to modern species, and the stylized forms in temple art cannot serve as precise botanical illustrations. The safer conclusion is that the expedition transported living resin-producing trees or shrubs valued for sacred aromatics. Their importance is clear even if their exact species remains debated. They are shown repeatedly, their root balls enclosed in containers, emphasizing that they are alive rather than cut timber. Uprooting such a plant without killing it requires knowledge. Workers must preserve a sufficient mass of roots, reduce damage, keep the root ball together, and prevent the exposed plant from drying out. The container must allow handling while holding soil or packing material in place. Branches may need to be tied or protected. The work is difficult even near a garden. After loading, a sea voyage, unloading, and an overland journey through desert heat, it becomes a serious logistical experiment. The Puntite suppliers may have played the decisive role in selecting and preparing the plants. They knew where the resin trees grew, which specimens were young enough to move, and how local soils and seasons affected survival. Egyptian officials could order trees, but they could not manufacture generations of environmental knowledge upon arrival. The successful preparation of living plants therefore depended on cooperation with people whose expertise is almost invisible in the royal narrative. The relief celebrates Egyptian acquisition. Yet the practical skill behind the trees may have belonged largely to Punt. Fresh water was the greatest constraint once the plants reached the ships. Every jar allocated to roots competed with the needs of sailors, animals, and cooking. Too little water would kill the trees, too much could loosen soil, increase weight, or encourage rot. Salt spray threatened leaves and roots. Strong wind could damage branches. A shifting container could injure the plant or destabilize nearby cargo. Sailors had to secure the trees while preserving access for watering and inspection. No single explanation fully accounts for how many survived. But the decision to attempt the transport implies careful planning rather than a symbolic gesture performed only for the artists. The return route did not end at the Red Sea coast. If the ships arrived at an Egyptian harbour, the plant still had to cross the eastern desert or be moved through a connected transport system toward the Nile. Pack animals, sledges, carriers, or carts could move smaller specimens, but each method created new risks: heat, delay, broken containers, and irregular watering threatened the routes. Once the expedition reached the river, boats could carry the plants more gently northward toward Thebes. The entire journey may have taken months, during which living cargo demanded attention every day. Hatshepsut's inscriptions claim that the trees were planted within the precinct of Amun, often understood to include the temple landscape at Deir el-Bahri. The terraced complex was not a barren monument dropped against the cliffs. Gardens, pools, planted areas, and processional spaces formed part of its design and meaning. To place Punt's trees, there was to create a living offering. The god would receive not only harvested resin, but the plants that produced it. A foreign species growing in sacred Egyptian soil could symbolize the ordered world gathering around Amun. Whether the trees flourished for years is harder to establish. Archaeological traces of planting pits and garden features at Deir el-Bahri show that vegetation was integral to the temple, but identifying specific remains as the original Punt trees is uncertain. Temple inscriptions speak in the language of successful royal action, not horticultural failure rates. Some plants may have survived, others may have died soon after arrival, and replacements may have been introduced later. What survives in the record suggests a genuine transplantation effort, but it does not allow a precise count of living trees or the duration of their survival. Even limited success would have been remarkable. Egypt was capable of sophisticated gardening, irrigation, transplantation, and estate management. Gardeners understood how to move plants, prepare soil, channel water, and create shaded environments. Yet a resin tree adapted to dry uplands or a different rainfall pattern might not thrive automatically in the Nile Valley. Its apparent familiarity with aridity could be misleading. Temperature, drainage, soil chemistry, seasonal moisture, and exposure all mattered. The tree had to survive not only distance but ecological translation. The royal message did not require every specimen to become a permanent plantation. The act of bringing them alive already demonstrated reach. Hatshepsut could claim that the wonders of a remote divine land had been made to grow beside her temple. The trees transformed the expedition from a cycle of consumption into an image of renewal. Resin burned and vanished in smoke, but a living tree promised repeated harvests. It suggested continuity, abundance, and control over time. This symbolism had an economic edge. If Egypt could cultivate valuable aromatics domestically, even on a limited scale, it might reduce dependence on long and dangerous expeditions. Yet the scale shown and the continuing prestige of imported resin argue against imagining a complete replacement of foreign supply. The temple garden was more likely a sacred demonstration, experimental cultivation, or elite collection than the beginning of a vast commercial industry. Punt remained valuable because its environments and networks produced quantities Egypt could not easily reproduce. There is also a deeper paradox in the scene. The trees are presented as gifts or marvels transferred into Egyptian order, but uprooting them separates them from the community and landscapes that sustained them. Their survival depends on recreating fragments of home in foreign soil. They become botanical captives, sacred immigrants, and political symbols at once. The relief does not dwell on that tension. It shows purposeful movement, strong carriers, and the certainty of royal success. Yet among all the gold, ivory, skins, and animals, the trees preserve the most intimate trace of Punt. They once drew water from its ground and resin from its climate. Their roots held actual particles of a landscape modern researchers still struggle to locate. Carried across the sea, they offered Egypt something no carved map could provide: a living piece of the missing land, breathing for a time beneath the cliffs of Thebes. The baboons carried north from the Red Sea world became something stranger than royal curiosities. In Egypt, they crossed from trade into religion, from living animals into sacred symbols, and finally from bodies into evidence. Long after the ports, roots, and names of their homeland had blurred, their teeth and bones continued to preserve traces of the landscapes where they were born. The animals that once greeted dawn from temple walls would eventually become living coordinates for a land that had slipped beyond history. Baboons already held a powerful place in Egyptian thought. Their loud dawn behavior, with bodies turned toward the rising sun and arms lifted, encouraged associations with solar renewal. They also became linked with Thoth, the god of writing, reckoning, wisdom, and lunar order. In art, baboons could appear seated with a moon disk, attending scribes, or participating in scenes of cosmic balance. The animal's foreign origin did not diminish its sacred value, it intensified it. A creature brought from the distant south carried the prestige of the horizon and the mystery of lands associated with divine abundance. Importing a baboon was difficult. Unlike resin, ebony, or ivory, a living animal could not be sealed in a container and ignored until arrival. It required water, food, restraint, ventilation, and handlers capable of managing its strength and stress. Sea travel added motion, heat, salt, noise, and confinement. The overland journey from harbour to Nile added another stage. Every surviving baboon therefore represented an expensive chain of capture, transport, care, and institutional support. What survives in the record suggests that Egypt did not receive these animals casually. Their symbolic value justified the cost. Once in Egypt, some baboons may have entered temple establishments or elite collections. Others were kept for extended periods in captivity, and a number were eventually mummified. Archaeological study of baboon remains from Gabanat el-Kurud has revealed skeletal and dental changes consistent with long-term confinement, restricted movement, and nutritional stress. Its importance lies in showing that Egypt maintained imported sacred animals within a managed system, rather than displaying them briefly. Some may even have been born in captivity, suggesting attempts to sustain populations away from their native range. That long captivity created a problem for modern researchers. A baboon's body records both where it formed and where it later lived. Teeth develop at particular stages and preserve chemical signatures from early life more securely than tissues that continue to change. Bone, hair, and soft tissue can reflect later diet and water. By comparing these different parts, researchers can sometimes distinguish an animal born abroad from one that spent years in Egypt. The body becomes a layered travel record: childhood in one environment, adulthood in another. The key tools are isotopes, especially oxygen and strontium. Oxygen isotope ratios are influenced by drinking water, rainfall, temperature, and evaporation. Strontium enters the body through food and reflects local geology and soils. Neither provides a street address. Together, however, they can narrow the range of environments compatible with an animal's early life. Researchers compare ancient values with modern reference samples collected from known baboon populations across Africa and Arabia. The method depends on the quality of those reference maps and on assumptions about how much geographic patterns have changed. A study published in 2020 compared oxygen and strontium signatures from mummified baboons with samples from modern animals at dozens of locations. 2 Hamadryas baboons dating to the New Kingdom produced results consistent with a broad region covering much of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti, along with parts of Somalia and Yemen. One animal appears to have been born outside Egypt and then lived in the Nile Valley for years. Another may have died relatively soon after transport. These differences reveal multiple biographies within the trade. The result was important for the Punt question because Hamadryas baboons inhabit the southern Red Sea and Horn of Africa, exactly where many scholars already suspected a Punt network. Yet the study did not locate a capital, a harbour, or Hatshepsut's landing place. Its geographic signal spans both sides of the sea. A baboon obtained at an African port could have come from inland. Another acquired through an Arabian market might have originated across the water. The animals identify a region of movement, not a political border. This limitation is a clue to how Punt may have functioned. If the Egyptian name referred to a trade corridor or group of connected communities, then a broad biological signature is what might be expected. Baboons could move from highlands to lowlands, from local capture sites to caravan routes, and from inland markets to coastal ships. Their final place of exchange may not match their place of birth. The chemical evidence therefore maps the network behind the port, not merely the port itself. The animals also complicate the old habit of treating Punt as a single dot. Their possible origins overlap Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, eastern parts of the Horn, and the Arabian shore. This does not mean that every one of these regions was Punt in the same sense. It means the Red Sea connected them. Goods, animals, people, and information crossed ecological and maritime boundaries. A coastal ruler could present a baboon whose birthplace lay far beyond his immediate territory. Egypt would remember the animal as a marvel of Punt, even though its life had already crossed several local worlds. There is an irony in using sacred animals as geographic evidence. The Egyptians valued baboons for meanings that moved them away from ordinary biology. They became embodiments of divine knowledge, solar praise, and ritual order. Modern science moves in the opposite direction, returning them to geology, rainfall, diet, and birthplace. The same body can sustain both readings. In a temple, it belonged to Thoth. In a laboratory, its tooth enamel belongs to a map. No single animal can settle the question. Sample sizes remain small, preservation is uneven, and museum histories are not always complete. Some mummies may have been mislabeled, moved, or collected without precise archaeological context. Modern baboon ranges may not perfectly reproduce ancient distributions. Scholars still debate how confidently isotopic matches can distinguish neighbouring regions. The evidence remains incomplete, but it has changed the search. Punt is no longer approached only through inscriptions and carved scenery. It can be investigated through the chemistry of creatures that travelled the route. The baboons thus become witnesses without language. They cannot name the port where they were loaded or the people who captured them. They cannot explain whether Egyptian sailors called their homeland Punt, Wetanet, or something else. Yet they retain what monuments amid the water they drank, the soils beneath the plants they ate, and the distance between birth and burial. Their bodies preserve the geography of movement. Long after incense smoke vanished into temple roofs, the animals remained, carrying a faint southern landscape inside their teeth. The isotopes narrowed the search to a broad southern world, but chemistry alone could not tell researchers whether the animals belonged to one long-lived population, moved through several ports, or reached Egypt along routes that changed over centuries. Another kind of evidence became possible: ancient DNA, where isotopes record water, geology, and diet. DNA records ancestry. It cannot reveal the exact harbour where a baboon boarded a ship, but it can connect an ancient individual with related populations. That matters if Punt was not one fixed destination, but a network whose centre shifted with time. In 2023, researchers published a mitochondrial genome from a mummified Hamadryas baboon, dated roughly between 800 and 540 BCE. This animal lived many centuries after Hatshepsut's expedition, when Egypt's political world and Red Sea connections had changed. The date limits what can be claimed. It cannot identify the 18th dynasty fleet's landing place, or prove that one route remained unchanged into the first millennium BCE. Yet the animal still preserves evidence of continuity across a region repeatedly linked with Egypt's southern trade. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the maternal line. It represents only one part of an individual's genetic history, not the entire nuclear genome. Even so, it is especially valuable in ancient remains because many copies exist in each cell, increasing the chance that enough fragments survive for reconstruction. The researchers compared the mummy's mitochondrial sequence with modern and historical baboon samples from northeastern Africa and Arabia. The closest connections pointed toward populations in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and eastern Sudan. This result strengthened a pattern already emerging from isotopic work. Both methods drew attention toward the African side of the southern Red Sea and the northeastern Horn, although neither reduced Punt to a single location. The DNA study also raised the importance of Adulis, the ancient port on the Eritrean coast that became prominent in later periods. Adulis occupied a strategic position between the Red Sea, the Eritrean highlands, and inland routes, receiving animals and products before transferring them northward. The temptation to declare Adulis the lost city of Punt is understandable and misleading. The ancient baboon was later than Hatshepsut by many centuries. Its ancestry indicates geographic affinity, not the name of the port where it was acquired. Adulis is securely known from classical and later evidence, but no inscription discovered there identifies the settlement as Punt. The responsible conclusion is narrower. The region around Adulis may have formed part of a long-lived corridor through which baboons and other goods moved toward Egypt. Punt and Adulis may belong to related commercial geographies without being the same political entity or city. This distinction reveals how ancient trade names can outlast particular settlements. Egyptian scribes might use Punt for desirable southern products, even as the ports handling them changed. A familiar name could remain attached to a route, an ecological source zone, or a category of foreign wealth. Later merchants might operate through Adulis while drawing on inland networks similar to those that earlier expeditions had reached elsewhere. The continuity could lie in the region and its resources, not in one harbour occupied without interruption. Baboons were useful indicators of such networks because their natural ranges overlap the southern Red Sea world. Hamadryas populations inhabit dry landscapes in the Horn of Africa and parts of Arabia, often near escarpments and water sources. Animals could be captured inland, moved to coastal centres, and exchanged between intermediaries before reaching Egypt. Their genetic ancestry would reflect the maternal population from which they came, while their place of sale might lie far away. DNA follows bloodlines across a commercial map that ancient political labels only partly describe. The study also depends on modern and museum reference samples. Present-day distributions are not perfect mirrors of ancient ones. Populations can expand, contract, mix, or disappear. Historical specimens may have uncertain collecting locations, and genetic drift can alter lineages over time. Scholars still debate how stable these geographic patterns have remained, and no single ancient genome can represent the full diversity of baboons supplied to Egypt. Preservation creates another limit. Ancient DNA survives unevenly in warm climates, and mummification, burial conditions, later handling, and museum storage all affect recovery. Contamination must be distinguished from authentic ancient sequence. Even when a mitochondrial genome is reconstructed, it offers one line of ancestry from one animal. A nuclear genome would provide a richer account of mixed ancestry and population relationships, but recovering it is more difficult. The evidence remains incomplete because the surviving sample is extraordinarily narrow. Still, the combination of DNA and isotopes changes the character of the Punt debate. Earlier generations depended mainly on Egyptian texts, temple art, and comparisons between depicted plants, animals, and houses. Those remain essential, but they are filtered through royal ideology and artistic convention. Biological evidence is filtered differently. A baboon's genome was not composed to praise a pharaoh. Its teeth were not arranged to express theology. They provide an independent line of investigation. Together, the methods reveal different moments in an animal's history. DNA indicates ancestry. Toothless enamel can preserve the environment of early life. Bone or soft tissue may reflect later residence. Archaeological context reveals where the body was buried or stored. When these strands agree, researchers can reconstruct movement with greater confidence. When they disagree, the discrepancy may expose a complicated biography, an animal descended from one region, born in another, transported through a third, and kept for years in Egypt. That possibility mirrors the trade network itself. Punt may have been experienced by Egyptians at a coastal settlement, while the goods they received carried origins scattered across mountains, dry valleys, highlands, savannas, and the opposite shore. The label gathered this movement into one comprehensible name. Modern science separates it again, showing that each animal and object followed its own route. A dualist therefore matters not as a final answer but as a historical bridge. It demonstrates that the Eritrean coast remained connected to long-distance exchange long after Hatshepsut. It links maritime traffic with highland and interior supply zones. The later baboon suggests that sacred animals could continue moving through this corridor toward Egypt. Such continuity makes the region a compelling candidate for part of the older Punt network, while leaving open the location of earlier ports and political centres. The ancient genome does not close the map, it adds depth to it. Beneath the carved image of a foreign land appears a population history measured through maternal descent. The baboon's body carries a line back toward Eritrea, Ethiopia, and eastern Sudan, but the path from that ancestry to an Egyptian shrine remains hidden. Between birthplace and burial stood hunters, handlers, traders, ships, and ports whose names are gone. DNA can illuminate the region. It cannot restore every human link. Punt remains just beyond identification, but its southern horizon is becoming harder to dismiss. By the time the scientific evidence reaches Eritrea, Ethiopia, Eastern Sudan, Djibouti, Somalia, and the Arabian coast, the question seems almost solved. The map narrows, yet this is where caution becomes most important. Punt was real enough to send resin, trees, ebony, ivory, animals, and gold toward Egypt, but no excavated settlement has produced an inscription identifying itself as Punt. Every proposed location must therefore be tested against texts, ecology, archaeology, trade routes, and later history, none of which fits perfectly alone. Eritrea stands near the center of many current arguments. Its coast faces the Red Sea, its interior connects highland and lowland zones, and its position suits movement between ports and inland sources. Baboons from the broader region match isotopic and genetic evidence. Obsidian found at Mersa and Wadi Gawasis has been traced partly to Eritrean sources, showing that materials from this coast entered Middle Kingdom exchange networks. The later port of Adulis adds another layer because it became a major transfer point between the Red Sea and the African interior. None of this proves that Adulis was Punt, but it makes the Eritrean corridor difficult to ignore. Eastern Sudan is equally important. Routes inland toward the el-Bahri region and the wider northeast African interior could connect maritime trade with animals, gold, ivory, and other products. DNA from a later mummified baboon points toward affinities that include Eastern Sudan, while Egyptian geographical traditions may distinguish several southern lands whose boundaries overlapped. Some scholars place Wetternet along the Sudanese or Eritrean coast, rather than treating every southern reference as Punt. This matters because the Egyptians may have recognized a more complex geography than modern summaries allow. Ethiopia enters the debate through highland ecology, baboon populations, incense routes, and inland connections that later fed Red Sea ports. Present borders did not exist in antiquity, and speaking of Punt as Ethiopia creates false precision, still, parts of the Ethiopian highlands and lowlands belong naturally within the supply zone suggested by biological evidence. Animals, resins, ivory, and other goods could move from interior communities toward coastal intermediaries. Punt may have been encountered at the shore while drawing wealth from landscapes now within Ethiopia. Djibouti occupies a strategic position near the Bab el-Mandeb, where the Red Sea narrows toward the Gulf of Aden. Its arid environments, maritime access, and proximity to African and Arabian shores make it a plausible part of the network. Isotopic research on New Kingdom baboons includes Djibouti within the broad region compatible with some individuals, yet compatibility is not identification. No excavated Djiboutian site has been securely labelled as Punt, and its role may have been that of a passage, source zone, or intermediary coast rather than a political centre. Somalia has long held a prominent place in popular discussions because its northern regions are famous for frankincense and myrrh, and because its coastline opens toward the Gulf of Aden and Indian Ocean. These facts make parts of Somalia relevant to the incense trade, but placing all of Punt there creates difficulties. The strongest baboon and archaeological signals extend farther north and west, and the Egyptian route may have favoured destinations closer to Eritrea or Eastern Sudan. Somali regions could still have supplied products through long-distance exchange without being the sole territory Egyptians called Punt. Southern Arabia presents the most persistent alternative. Yemen and neighbouring regions produced aromatic resins and participated in maritime trade. Obsidian at Wadi Gawasis has been traced not only to Eritrea, but also to volcanic sources in Yemen, demonstrating contact across both shores. Hamadryas baboons also live in Arabia, and isotopic results do not exclude parts of Yemen. Punt cannot therefore be discussed as though the Arabian coast were irrelevant. Yet Arabian evidence does not automatically relocate Punt across the sea. Red Sea trade was interconnected. An Egyptian harbour could receive obsidian from Yemen, resin from African or Arabian sources, and animals whose ancestral range crossed both shores. Cargo does not always identify the political land named in a text. Yemeni material proves exchange, not the nationality of the entire network. African ecological clues in Hatshepsut's reliefs, including the likely secretary bird, continue to support a substantial African component. The most convincing model may be regional rather than national. Punt could have referred to a core zone on the African side of the southern Red Sea, linked to Eritrea, eastern Sudan, and neighbouring inland regions, while participating in a broader network extending through Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and southern Arabia. Egyptian expeditions may have reached coastal markets where goods from many origins had already converged. The name described the commercial and sacred geography as Egypt experienced it, not boundaries recognized by local communities. This model explains why evidence refuses to converge on one capital. If Punt consisted of several ports, inland routes, seasonal markets, and shifting political centres, archaeology should reveal fragments rather than one spectacular lost city. A harbour may preserve imported pottery but no Egyptian name. An inland settlement may show resin processing but no maritime connection. A baboon may indicate ancestry in one region while being sold in another. Obsidian may cross the sea before reaching Egypt. The contradiction may reflect the structure of the ancient system itself. Names can move as easily as goods. Egyptian scribes may have used Punt differently across centuries as routes changed and new intermediaries gained prominence. Beer Punt, Punt, and neighbouring terms may not always describe identical spaces. A word once referring to a coast could expand to include associated products, or survive after the main harbour shifted. Scholars still debate these possibilities because the texts are too few and ceremonial to trace every change. The search is also distorted by preservation. Red Sea shorelines change, harbours silt up, erode, or become buried. Organic trading settlements leave lighter traces than stone temples. Coastal communities may have built with wood, reeds, and earth, materials unlikely to survive for millennia. Political instability and limited excavation have left large areas underexplored. The absence of a labelled Puntite capital may reflect both the network's nature and archaeology's unevenness. The mystery persists because modern geography asks ancient evidence to provide a precision it was never designed to preserve, so the map remains open. Eritrea and eastern Sudan hold some of the strongest converging clues. Ethiopia and Djibouti fit the inland and coastal ecology. Somalia remains significant for resin and wider exchange. Southern Arabia belongs to the same maritime world. None can be dismissed, and none can claim the entire mystery. Punt emerges not as a dot waiting to be discovered, but as a southern horizon organized by movement. Its reality lay in roots, relationships, and products crossing landscapes that modern borders divide. The closer the search comes to the Red Sea, the clearer it becomes that finding Punt may require abandoning the idea that it was ever only one place. The closer the search moves toward the Red Sea, the more important it becomes to distinguish the destination from the point of departure. Mersa and Wadi Gawasis, on Egypt's western Red Sea coast, have sometimes been casually folded into the story as though they were fragments of Punt itself. They are not. The site is Egyptian, identified with the ancient harbour called Sor, and its importance lies precisely in showing how Egypt prepared for voyages toward Punt. It is the last organised foothold before the expedition entered the maritime world beyond direct royal control. The harbour was not a permanent city in the monumental sense. It functioned through temporary installations, storage spaces, workshops, food production, shrines, and repeated seasonal occupation. Crews arrived from the Nile after crossing the eastern desert. Ship components, rope, tools, provisions, and personnel converged there. The coast became a staging ground where the state transformed inland resources into a seagoing fleet. What survives is not a grand palace or stone quay, but something more revealing the practical debris of departure. Excavations uncovered galleries cut into the coastal landscape, some used for storing nautical equipment after expeditions returned. Inside and around them were timbers from ships, rope, steering elements, anchors, containers, ceramics, and traces of food. These finds give physical form to processes that royal inscriptions compress into a line or two. A vessel did not simply appear on the Red Sea. It had to be built, disassembled or transported, reconstructed, outfitted, loaded, repaired, and stored again. The ship timbers are among the most extraordinary discoveries because they preserve the material intelligence of Egyptian seafaring. That achievement is easy to underestimate. Joints, lashings, wear patterns, and reused pieces reveal vessels designed to be taken apart and managed across multiple environments. Timber was too valuable to abandon casually. After a voyage, components could be hauled into storage galleries for protection from sun and wind, then recovered for later missions. Some pieces were reused in ways that show prolonged service rather than one ceremonial expedition. The harbour therefore held a memory of ships in wood, not only in inscriptions. Rope tells a similar story. Large coils of cordage survived conditions that normally destroy organic material. Rope carried the strain of masts, sails, hull lashings, anchors, towing, and cargo. A broken line at the wrong moment could damage a ship or cost lives. Producing strong cordage required fibers, labour, twisting, testing, and maintenance. The scale of the surviving material suggests planned provisioning rather than emergency improvisation. It also reveals how much of ancient maritime technology depended on perishable materials that rarely survive elsewhere. Cargo containers add another dimension. Wooden boxes, jars, and ceramic vessels could carry food outward and imported products home. Labels or inscriptions link some containers with expeditions and destinations. Their shapes and residues help reconstruct what was stored, while their distribution across the site shows how supplies moved between galleries, camps, and ships. These modest objects are the administrative skeleton of long-distance trade. Without them, resin could not be protected, grain could not be rationed, and water could not be measured. Food production at the harbour makes the expedition human again. Ovens, grinding tools, botanical remains, and installations associated with bread reveal the labour of sustaining crews before departure. Men did not march from the Nile, assemble vessels, and sail immediately. They waited, worked, repaired, ate, and performed rituals. bakers and food preparers were essential members of the operation. Their work transported grain into daily survival before the ships left the coast. Recent fieldwork resumed attention to these domestic and ritual spaces, including the small shrine associated with an official named Anku and the routes connecting the harbour with the interior. Such research matters because a port is more than its shoreline. It depends on roads, wells, supply stations, labour camps, and communication with the Nile Valley. The desert route was the artery that kept Saw alive. Every beam, jar, sack, and person had to cross it, and every returning cargo had to travel back through the same constricted corridor. Inscriptions at the site name voyages to Punt and preserve the careers of officials who led them. The re-evaluation of Stela WG-29 connected with an expedition under Senmusret II shows how these texts used familiar formulas of service, achievement, and royal favour. They were not raw logs. They were composed within literary and commemorative traditions, yet their placement at the harbour suggests that later crews encountered the words of predecessors in the very landscape of departure. This created a ritual continuity between missions. Before sailing, officials could visit shrines, read names, make offerings, and position their own journey within a chain of earlier success. The harbour became an archive of maritime memory. Its monuments did not merely celebrate completed voyages, they helped prepare future ones by turning past survival into divine precedent. A crew facing the Red Sea could see evidence that others had left, reached Punt, and returned. The archaeology also links Egypt to both sides of the sea. Obsidian artifacts from the harbour have been traced to sources in Eritrea and Yemen. This does not mean the site imported directly from only those places, nor does it prove the Sunt lay in either source region. Obsidian could move through several hands before reaching Egypt. Its importance is broader. It demonstrates that Middle Kingdom exchange already connected African and Arabian volcanic landscapes within one Red Sea system. Other imported materials and ceramic traditions point toward contact zones beyond Egypt, but the pattern is fragmentary. A port receives objects from wherever ships and intermediaries bring them. Archaeology at Saw records the endpoint of many journeys without preserving every stop along the way. The harbour can show that Egypt reached outward. It cannot by itself identify the political geography encountered at the far end. This distinction protects the story from one of its most common errors. Mersa Wadi Gawasis is not the lost city of Punt. It is the place from which Egyptian expeditions attempted to reach Punt and to which some returned. Its caves, ropes, timbers, and inscriptions belong to Egypt's side of the relationship. They reveal state organization, maritime skill, and repeated commitment, but they do not supply the missing local voice. Even so, Saw may be the clearest archaeological proof that Punt was no fantasy. The ships were real, the ropes were real, the food was prepared, the cargo boxes built, the inscriptions carved, and the crews assembled on an actual shore. The destination remains elusive, but the machinery created to reach it lies beneath Egyptian sand. At the harbour, mystery becomes logistics. The incense trails do not begin in legend. They begin with timber dragged across desert stone, bread baked near the coast, and sailors stepping aboard vessels whose timbers still bear the strain of the Red Sea. Saw proves that Egyptians repeatedly built the machinery required to reach Punt, but it also sharpens the question haunting the entire story. If the route, ships, and cargo were real, why did Punt disappear so completely from the map? The simplest answer is that it may never have been a single place capable of disappearing like a city. A harbour can be abandoned, a kingdom can fall, A name attached to a network can fade while trade continues through other ports, rulers, and words. Egyptian references to Punt stretch across centuries, but they do not remain equally frequent or detailed. Political strength rose and fell along the Nile. Central governments lost control, regained it, and redirected resources toward war, construction, or recovery. Expeditions across the eastern desert and down the Red Sea required exceptional organization. Wells had to be maintained, roads secured, ship timber gathered, crews paid, and harbors prepared. A disruption at any stage could make direct voyages impractical even if demand for incense continued. The wider region also changed. New powers emerged, older states fragmented, caravan corridors shifted, coastal settlements gained or lost importance as shorelines and alliances changed. Goods once obtained by direct expedition could arrive through intermediaries, if African, Arabian, Nubian, or Levantine merchants delivered aromatic resins closer to the Nile. Egyptian rulers had less reason to send fleets to the distant source. Trade could survive while Punt receded from official attention. This distinction between direct contact and indirect supply is essential. A resin might be gathered in one upland, traded to a coastal community, transferred across the Red Sea, carried north by another group, and finally sold through a later port. By the time it reached Egypt, several political worlds had touched it. The older designation Punt may have ceased to describe the most important point in that chain. The rise of Adulis in later antiquity illustrates how a regional corridor could persist under a new identity. Located on the Eritrean coast and linked with inland highlands, Adulis became a major centre of Red Sea commerce. Baboons, ivory, aromatics, and other products could move through such a port long after Hatshepsut. The mitochondrial DNA of a later mummified baboon supports connections with Eritrea, Ethiopia, and eastern Sudan, but it does not show that Adulis was simply Punt renamed. More cautiously, it suggests continuity in trade geography as political labels and urban centres changed. Environmental processes may also have obscured the evidence. Red Sea coastlines are unstable over long periods. Harbours can silt up, lagoons close, reefs alter access, and settlements built of light materials vanish beneath sediment or erosion. Earthquakes and sea level change may transform shorelines. A community dependent on one anchorage might relocate without leaving monumental ruins. If Puntite settlements used wood, reeds, mud, or modest stone architecture, later archaeology could easily miss them, especially where survey remains limited. Climate change may have affected inland routes and resin production, although no single explanation fully accounts for Punt's disappearance. Shifts in rainfall could change pasture, water availability, and tree distribution. A corridor that once supported seasonal caravans might become unreliable. Resin-bearing species may survive, but communities organizing collection and transport can move. The commercial landscape would transform without the biological source vanishing. Political change within Egypt mattered just as much. Later rulers inherited different priorities: military pressure, succession struggles, economic strain, and changes in temple wealth altered what could be attempted and what deserved monumental commemoration. Hatshepsut's voyage became famous partly because it was carved with exceptional ambition. Other expeditions may have occurred without comparable treatment, while some royal claims may have repeated older formulas after direct contact diminished. The fate of Hatshepsut's monuments adds a further irony. After her death, many of her names and images were altered or erased during Thutmose III's reign. probably in a complex reshaping of royal succession, rather than a simple personal vendetta. The Punt scenes survived only in damaged form. Later quarrying, religious change, and natural decay removed more. The most detailed Egyptian record of the land was itself subjected to deliberate and accidental forgetting. Punt's disappearance is partly the disappearance of archives that once described it. Local names pose another problem. The people encountered by Egyptians may never have called their region Punt. The term belongs to Egyptian language and classification. It could refer to a direction, a sacred foreign zone, a cluster of products, or several communities linked through trade. If local societies continued under different names, archaeology might discover them without recognizing them as Punt. Researchers searching for the Egyptian word on a foreign inscription may be waiting for evidence that was never likely to exist. The Egyptian vocabulary itself may also have changed. Punt, Bir Punt, and neighbouring southern names such as Witenet do not necessarily describe identical spaces in every period. A term could emphasize a mining zone, a ritual landscape, a coast, or the source of a favoured product. Later scribes might preserve old names while attaching them to altered roots. Modern borders further complicate the search. Eritrea, Sudan, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and Yemen divide a maritime world. Ancient sailors experienced through coasts, islands, winds, and inland paths. A network spanning several regions appears vague only because modern mapping expects fixed territories. Punt may have been precise to Egyptians in practice, while difficult to translate into modern political geography. Sailors needed to know which harbour, season, ruler, and route to use. They did not need to define a national boundary. Popular theories sometimes identify Punt with places as distant as southern Africa, India, or mythical lands. Such proposals usually depend on selective resemblance rather than the combined weight of archaeology, ecology, texts, and biological evidence. The mainstream picture remains centered on the southern Red Sea and Horn of Africa, especially the African coast and connected interior. The mystery is not that evidence points everywhere. It is that the strongest evidence points to a region too interconnected to reduce to one lost capital. Punt may therefore have disappeared because the name ceased to be useful. Trees continued producing resin. Baboons still lived in dry highlands and escarpments. Ivory, gold, ebony, and skins still moved through African networks. Ships continued crossing the Red Sea. What changed were the ports, intermediaries, political centres, and terms by which outsiders described them. A trading world can survive the death of its label. This is why no ruined gate has ended the search. Archaeologists are not necessarily looking for one buried city whose discovery will resolve every contradiction. They are reconstructing a moving system from Egyptian harbours, temple reliefs, animal bodies, obsidian sources, and scattered coastal remains. Punt faded from texts, but the network behind it dissolved into later history rather than vanishing without trace. Its disappearance may be less an extinction than a transformation, a familiar landscape slipping behind new names while its goods continued travelling north. The search for Punt ends where it began, in the distance between evidence and certainty. Egypt's own records tell us that expeditions sailed south, crossed dangerous water, and returned with aromatic resins, living trees, ivory, ebony, gold, animal skins, and baboons. Archaeology at Soar shows that these journeys required real ships, real rope, real food, real labour, and an organized state capable of moving men and materials across desert and sea. The reliefs at Deir el-Bahri preserve a vivid foreign landscape, but they also reveal how royal memory reshaped trade into theology. Isotopes and DNA draw the map toward the southern Red Sea and the Horn of Africa, especially Eritrea, eastern Sudan, Ethiopia, and neighboring regions. Obsidian points across both African and Arabian shores. Every line of evidence narrows the mystery, yet none closes it. This may be the most important conclusion. Punt has not remained hidden because the evidence is useless. It remains hidden because the evidence describes movement more clearly than territory. Ships leave Egypt from one harbour. Resin may come from dry uplands far inland. Baboons may be born in one region, transferred through another, and sold at a third. Ebony and ivory travel through chains extending beyond the coast. Obsidian crosses the sea. Egyptian artists gather all these origins into one comprehensible image and one name. Modern researchers then try to unfold that image back into the separate roots from which it was made. The strongest model places the core of Punt on the African side of the southern Red Sea, linked particularly with Eritrea, eastern Sudan, and adjacent inland zones, while allowing the commercial network to extend through Ethiopia, Djibouti, Somalia, and southern Arabia. That formulation is less dramatic than announcing the discovery of a lost kingdom, but it fits the evidence better. Punt may have been a region, a corridor, a shifting group of communities, or several of these at different times. Its limits may never have been fixed, and the Egyptians themselves may have used the name flexibly across centuries. Hatshepsut's expedition gives this broad world a single memorable face. Her ships, the raised houses, the ruler Parihu and his wife Ati, the trees packed for transport, and the orderly presentation of goods create an encounter that feels immediate even after more than 3,000 years. Yet the scene is not a transparent window. It belongs to a temple designed to show that Amun commanded distant abundance and that Hatshepsut fulfilled the command. The artists arranged people, animals, and products within conventions of royal and sacred order. Recent comparisons with other Theban scenes show that texts and images could be reused, adapted, and placed within familiar formulas. This does not erase the voyage. It reminds us that history survives through the purposes of those who record it. The Puntites themselves remain beyond that record. We see their forms, dwellings, animals, and leaders. But we do not hear what they called their homeland or how they understood the Egyptian arrival. Their side of the negotiation is absent. They may have regarded the fleet as one visitor among several within a Red Sea trading world already connecting coast, highland, desert, and interior. The goods Egypt admired were not simply waiting in nature. They were collected, cultivated, captured, carried, measured, guarded, and exchanged through local knowledge. Punt's real wealth lay in people who knew how to move resources across difficult landscapes. The Baboons reveal this hidden network with unusual clarity. To Egyptian priests, they could embody sacred knowledge, lunar order, and the greeting of the rising sun. To modern laboratories, their teeth and genomes preserve birthplace and ancestry. Isotopic analysis points toward a broad southern Red Sea zone rather than a single harbour. Mitochondrial DNA from a later mummy strengthens connections with Eritrea, Ethiopia, and eastern Sudan, while raising the possibility of long-term continuity through the Adulis corridor. Yet no baboon can name Punt. The animals show where life began, and sometimes where it later moved, but not the political label attached to the trade. That limitation is not a failure. It exposes the true shape of the problem. A lost city can be found by locating its ruins. A lost network must be reconstructed from fragments that were never meant to fit into one monument. Saw preserves the Egyptian machinery of departure. Deir el-Bahri preserves the royal theology of return. Resin terminology preserves changing categories of fragrance. Animal remains preserve biology. Obsidian preserves geological origin. Later ports preserve regional continuity. None alone is Punt, but together they outline the world in which Punt existed. The incense itself may be the most fitting symbol. It arrived as solid resin, carefully collected and transported, then vanished through use. Burned before a god, it became smoke, scent, and memory. Its material form disappeared at the moment its sacred purpose was fulfilled. Punt suffered a similar fate in history. Its goods entered Egypt and were transformed into ritual, prestige, and royal legitimacy. The roots and communities behind them faded as political systems changed. Later ports took over older corridors. Names shifted, coastlines altered. What remained was the fragrance of contact without the map of its source. For that reason, the mystery should not be forced into a final declaration. Scholars may one day identify a port or settlement more securely connected with Egyptian expeditions. New excavations may recover inscriptions, botanical residues, imported ceramics, or ship remains from the southern coast. Ancient DNA may be extracted from additional animals. Isotopic reference maps may become more precise, but even a major discovery may reveal only one node within a larger system. Punt's identity may always require a plural answer. The unresolved geography also protects the people of Punt from being reduced to a footnote in Egyptian achievement. They were not merely suppliers at the edge of someone else's empire. They belonged to societies with their own political traditions, sacred landscapes, and memories of the sea. Archaeology may eventually recover more of those worlds, but until it does, restraint is part of accuracy. The mystery is not permission to invent them. It is an obligation to recognize how much of their history was never carved for Egypt to keep. The land endures because Egypt preserved its value more successfully than its geography. Hatshepsut's walls kept the ships moving. Temple ritual kept the resins meaningful. Sacred animal cults kept baboon bodies in conditions that allowed science to question them thousands of years later. Desert caves at Saw protected the ropes and timbers of expeditions whose crews had vanished. Across all these traces, Punt appears not as fantasy, but as a relationship between Nile and Red Sea, coast and interior, Africa and Arabia, commerce and religion, observation and royal invention. And so the fleet returns once more in the mind. The sails are lowered, cargo is carried ashore, rooted trees sway in their bindings, resin fills the air before it ever reaches the temple flame. Somewhere far behind, the southern coast recedes into haze. The sailors know the route because others taught it to them. The Puntites return to their own roads, herds, markets, and hills. Neither side can know that the Egyptian version of this meeting will survive while the local names fade. Time softens the edges of every civilization, harbours close, languages change, sacred plants die in unfamiliar soil. A king's carefully carved image is damaged, erased, restored, and studied by people she could never have imagined. Even stone does not preserve the past whole. It preserves selections, absences, and intentions. Punt remains within those absences. It lingers in the hollow galleries where rope was stored, in tooth enamel formed beneath distant rain, in a maternal line preserved inside a mummified animal, and in the carved hands lifting trees toward a ship. None of these fragments speaks loudly. Together, they create a quiet geography. Beyond the temple, night gathers over the western desert. The Nile continues past fields and towns whose names have also changed. Far to the southeast, winds move over coasts that may once have received Egyptian ships. No monument then needs to bear the word Punt for the old connection to have been real. The sea remembers no names, but it keeps the distance between shores, the same distance crossed by timber, resin, animals, and human trust. Perhaps that is the truest form in which a vanished land can survive, not as a border drawn confidently across a modern map, but as a pattern repeated through different kinds of evidence, a scent in a sanctuary, a bird on a broken relief, volcanic glass carried across water, a harbour abandoned after the crews went home, a name used for centuries, then no longer used at all. The ships on Hatshepsut's wall never complete their voyage. They remain suspended between departure and return, between the real sea and the sacred one. Their destination lies beyond the carved edge, where the landscape opens and certainty ends. In the fading light against the cliffs of Thebes, the stone still holds the outline of masts, branches, animals, and people carrying the wealth of another world. The incense has long since burned away, but for a moment the air seems to remember it.